Last time we had a look at the cranium, the part of the skeletal system responsible for protecting the brain and important sense organs. But having a brain, eyes, ears, and jaws alone really doesn't help me get around much. These structures need to be hooked up to the rest of the body, and that kind of needs a backbone framework. What would make a good backbone? The backbone! Let's start with the basic anatomy of the vertebrae. The basic vertebral segment has a central body and arches to protect the spinal cord and blood vessels running alongside it. The centrum is the most prominent feature of the vertebra that has undergone changes in shape, number, and sizes relative to each other. Since there are two centra, one could be bigger than the other or disappear altogether. A single vertebral segment can have no centrum, 1, 2, or more. The centra could also either fuse with the vertebral arches or remain as distinct parts. The shapes of their contact points may also vary. To know more about the different shapes of centra, please watch this. It's all there. While you're trying to make sense of all these new words, the why behind the variations of these structures is fairly simple. It's a balancing act between mobility and rigidity. Why not just have a solid bony pipe protect the spinal cord and the blood vessels? Imagine putting on a back brace and you'll immediately notice how much your range of motion is limited by that.
Go! Run, Joanne, run!
On the other extreme, why not have nothing at all? Honestly, that could work. Hagfish and lampreys, that's the route that they went for. They don't have fully ossified vertebrae. They just stuck with mostly the notochord. But as a consequence, this may have confined them to living in water because it's hard to overcome the gravitational stresses with just cartilage alone. If we also consider their other workaround to protect themselves, which is mostly secreting mucus, those would only really work well in aquatic environments when paired with their notochord-only shtick. Hence, we now have the vertebrae as it is, segments of bone that give the best mix of maneuverability and durability. Varying the sizes of the centra relative to each other, fusion or separation of vertebral components, the shape of the articulating surfaces are various ways to achieve a spine structure best suited to an organism's environment. For example, the amphiplatean centra of mammals does decrease the flexibility of the spine, but it is better able to withstand head-to-tail compression from all the jumping and the running and such. The procelocentra of snakes allow for that ball and socket configuration, giving them a super flexible spine. The vertebral arches enclose the spinal cord and blood vessels, and in some cases they may extend dorsally and ventrally respectively to produce spines. There are also protrusions from the centra and/or these arches, collectively called the apophyses or apophyses. These protrusions often serve as muscle attachment points and/or prevent the spine from excessive twisting and flexing. Vertebral segments aren't just like bone-on-bone structures. We actually find ligaments and intervertebral cartilages in between them. These help stabilize the spine and prevent the segments from buckling under flexion, and also serve as shock absorbers. Vertebrae can also be classified based on their general location on the organism's body. Parang high school, barkadahan lang, di ba? Nagsasama-sama yung mga magkakatulad. Some segments look more alike than other segments, and that may be attributed to their respective functions, which we will get to later. Be patient. Fish vertebrae are pretty boring, subdivided into just trunk and tail regions. Tetrapods took this a few steps further, having more or less 5 major vertebral regions. I also discussed this briefly in that same video, so please, watch it! Ribs are attached dorsally to the vertebrae, and their classification is based on whether or not they are attached to the sternum. It serves as the main articulation of the ribs ventrally, allowing the ribs to work as a unit and form the rib cage. Now that we've had an overview of the anatomy of the postcranial axial skeleton, yes, it's the part of the axial skeleton that is after the head, it's time to take a step back and see how all these structures have been selected for either life on water or life on land. The advantage of living in water is an animal's weight can be partly supported by the buoyant force of water. Vertebrae, therefore, need not have those load-bearing, stabilizing features. So they end up looking almost the same from trunk to tail, as we see in a lot of aquatic vertebrates. Ribs are also therefore very minimal, serving mainly as muscle attachment points. But the drawbacks of life on water include drag and moving through a 3D space without spinning like a football. Drag is mostly resolved by having a streamlined body shape. But a streamlined body shape only makes movement through the water less energy costly. What really moves the body through the water is the caudal fin in most fishes. Hence, we see different types of caudal fins depending on how caudal vertebrae are oriented within them. Heterocercal fins prevail in chondrichthyes, while homocercal fins are typical for most bony fish. The difference in shape has something to do with how they stay afloat. Yes, there is a buoyant force of water, but this isn't enough to keep you from sinking. Bony fish have a swim bladder, which is basically a balloon inside their bodies. They can regulate their buoyancy by increasing or decreasing the amount of air inside. Cartilaginous fish don't have swim bladders, although they do have other adaptations for staying lightweight. The heterocercal tail also helps generate lift and keeps the shark from sinking, unless it wants to. Moving in a 3D space without pitching or yawing or spinning along your body axis is resolved by the other stabilizing fins like the dorsal fins, pectoral fins, anal fins, ventral fins, so on and so forth. How about life on land? Your main contender is gravity. Your postcranial axial skeleton therefore has to be built to overcome this. Cervical vertebrae should be strong enough to bear the weight of the whole head while enabling it to turn, twist, and be lifted above the ground so that you can open the jaws. Which is why in some tetrapods, the first two cervical vertebrae appear completely different from the remaining typical cervical vertebrae. The atlas is the segment in contact with the skull. Fun fact, this was named after the Titan atlas. The axis is the second cervical vertebra right behind the atlas. For limbed vertebrates, thoracic and lumbar vertebrae are the segments in between the limbs. Their primary role is to maintain a posture that keeps the animal from squishing itself like an accordion or buckling, or having its torso sag towards the ground. The neural spines in these regions may have different heights and orientations or directions. There's a lot of physics involved, but the point of these variations is so the muscles that attach to them ultimately direct the forces towards the strongest part of the vertebrae, the centra. Sacral vertebrae are closely associated with the hind limbs of tetrapods because they mainly transmit the force of the hind limbs to propel the rest of the body forward or upward. Hence, they are often fused into a sacrum. The amount of fused vertebrae is often related to how much load they need to bear. Birds go as much as to fuse the sacral vertebrae with the lumbar and posterior thoracic vertebrae into a synsacrum and fuse that whole synsacrum with the bones of the pelvis. Caudal vertebrae make up the tails of vertebrates. Tails of tetrapods mainly serve as stabilizers or counterweights, and those with prehensile tails can use these as their fifth limb. How about the ribs and sterna? In tetrapods, they protect and help suspend the organs in the torso. So you could think of like having a basket attached to a pole. They also serve as muscle attachment points, and they may also facilitate breathing. Snakes don't have a sternum, because a rib cage would only get in the way of all the coiling and slinking around. But they do have ribs all the way to the anus. That's mainly because the ribs are also partly used for locomotion. Turtles don't have a sternum either because, plastron. Crocodiles, aside from having sterna, also have ribs that support their abdomens called gastralia, which are similar to osteoderms in that they both originate from the dermis. Mammals, most amphibians, reptiles, and birds have sterna. Those of them with a more robust rib cage can somewhat elevate their torso off the ground much higher without their internal organs swinging around. Mammals have mostly confined their ribs to the thoracic region, which enables them to really swing their lower limbs or their hind limbs more anteriorly without crashing into the ribs. The most interesting sternum, though, has got to be the avian sternum. It has a huge mid-ventral because it has a huge mid-ventral projection called the keel or carina. This provides extra surface for flight muscles to attach. An emerging pattern is vertebrae tend to dominate in fully aquatic vertebrates, be they fish or marine mammals like cetaceans and sirenians, as this is the main scaffolding that facilitates locomotion. The fins and the flippers are mainly there to stabilize. Whereas the opposite could be said for vertebrates. Their limbs are the main players in locomotion, with the vertebrae mainly serving as stabilizers and the overall support structure. Which is why the appendicular skeleton will be the next leg, you get it? 'Cause leg, appendage, of this discussion. As always, a few more videos to help you get a bigger picture on the postcranial axial skeleton. Toodles!